Stephen, I have the very first question, and it's very simple. What sparked your interest in this subject?
What sparked my interest in this subject was actually being 8 years old and watching the first men land on the moon. I can remember very well sitting in my grandparents' apartment. My grandfather was born in 1893. Can you believe that? And there he was sitting in this apartment with me and with my grandmother, and we watched Neil Armstrong land on the moon. And I was just 8 years old at the time. And I can remember the amazement that my grandfather had. He was born, 10 years before the Wright brothers first flew. And here he was watching Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walking on the moon, live broadcast from the moon. I can remember being quite disappointed, actually, because I seem to remember it all looked like black and white shadows to me. And I was expecting it to be, grand sort of color like the best sci-fi films. But I do remember hearing the giant leap for mankind. I actually do remember hearing that. It's not something I think I remember. I do remember hearing that. And I suppose that's how it sparked off. I also had a cousin who worked at NASA and was working at the Johnson Space Center, probably just down the road from where you guys are. And I can remember going to Florida when I was about 10 years old in the early 1970s. And he had all this literature about Apollo, all this original stuff, It was probably all that kind of public relations stuff at the time. He gave that to me and I just devoured it. So that's where the real interest comes from. It comes from that time in my life into space. But if you're asking about how I got into the book, that's a different question.
Well, we'll get to that. So, Mark, I think you've got the first question for Stephen. So go ahead, or Mr. Walker. So go ahead.
Stephen, please. Yeah.
Yes. So my first question is, what was your favorite part of the research process for this book?
Oh, God, that's a really good question. Some things just never leave the mind. They really never leave the mind. Watching the Soyuz rocket in a sunset launch from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in September 2019 was unbelievable. It was an unbelievable thing to witness. We can talk a little bit about this extraordinary place, Baikonur, in what is now the independent Republic of Kazakhstan, and is still a little bit of the Soviet Union, it feels like it, in Kazakhstan. And the rocket launch took place, I think, at about 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening. And I've been to 2 rocket launches at Cape Canaveral. The Russians get you much closer. This was unbelievably close. It was like almost dangerously close. And I can remember the sun was just setting. There were probably about a couple of thousand people standing in front of a perimeter with our cameras at the ready. And suddenly the whole sky just lit up. It was quite incredible. The whole sky lit up. I've actually filmed this on my iPhone at the time, and everybody just makes this exclamation. This is like gasp as you see this thing lift the ground, knowing there are 3 people on top. One was a NASA astronaut, this woman who was there. Her entire family had flown out to watch her go. And you also realize the vulnerability of this too. You realize that these are people, something could go wrong. The thing could blow up. It was especially powerful for me because the launch pad that they were launching from is the same launch pad that Yuri Gagarin launched from way back in April 1961. So you're talking nearly 60 years later. It's the same launch pad. It almost looks like the same rocket. We can have a look in a moment. And suddenly you're watching this thing just go. And it's a visceral moment. It's a moment that is just thrilling. First the light, and then this rumble as the sound waves hit you. It is a kind of a shock wave of sound, and you really feel it, and much more so than the much less powerful rockets I was witnessing when I went to Cape Canaveral around the same, a couple of months later. This is much, much louder, and then you feel it. It's the sound and then the vibration, and the ground starts to tremble. And this thing just goes and up and up and up. It's just incredible. And we just watched it go, and it was exhilarating. And I can remember we all got on this bus a bunch of us that had managed after months and months to secure access to go to this place. And the bus went back to the town, which was about 25, 30 kilometers away. And by the time we got back to the town and we got back to our little hotel, pretty horrible hotel, I have to say, but our little hotel, and we were in our rooms, this thing had already gone once around the earth.
Wow.
Incredible to think. I mean, so there are viscerally exciting moments like that. There are people I met that were just incredible. I mean, we'd use up the whole of the hour if I started talking about it, but that's something that stays in the memory and will do forever.
Yeah, that reminds me, Stephen, I think the historian John Logsdon once told a aspiring historian, if you go to a lunch, you'll lose objectivity. Because, so interesting.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
Terry, I think you've got the next question, if I'm not mistaken. Are you there, Terry? Okay, well, I'll ask it then. So I don't know where she is. So how did you access the Soviet sources for the book? And what challenges did you find in accessing those sources?
Well, actually, the book didn't start as a book. It started as a documentary film. And that's where I first encountered the challenges. So I started the book. I had no intention of writing a book about this to begin with. In a way that's slightly a roundabout answer to the question, John. What happened was I had come across a diary by a guy that features in my book called Vladimir Suvorov, who is a cameraman, or was a cameraman, who was secretly enrolled to film the secret Soviet space program in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And there was a diary that was a part of his diary that was published in an English translation. And I came across it, I actually think I came across it in a secondhand bookshop somewhere. And I remember reading this thing and thinking, God, if this guy shot all these millions of feet of 35mm, mostly color footage, where is this footage? Where does it exist? I'd seen various little bits and pieces and clips over and over again, but where did this stuff actually exist? Could it be found? Could it be found? And there was a time when all these films were coming out about, about Apollo project, NASA, Apollo 11, where amazing footage was being dug up from the NASA archives. And I thought, if we could get this footage and we could restore it and bring it up to its original color glory, and make it really high res, high definition, we can put that on a theatrical screen. So I pitched it to a company, Working Title, in the UK, that's sort of Universal Studios. And I pitched it and they bought the pitch. So they paid me to go out and start doing research. So I began to research archive. That's what I started to do. I hired the best archivist in Russia and I went out and I started looking at footage. And at first it wasn't that difficult to find bits and pieces. And we did find some incredible material, raw stuff that had never, ever, ever been edited at all, where you can see the whole roll of film, basically. And it was quite extraordinary. But as I went back to Russia, I think I went 3 times between 2012 and 2014, it became, I think, as a direct result of the regime that's there, more and more difficult to access the material that we wanted to access. It just became tougher. Cutting rooms would close, archive centers were not that helpful. People would say they had an enormous amount of footage and they'd suddenly close down on us. We would sometimes find material which was literally being eaten by mice. As a lot of that, priceless stuff. So it got to the point where it became very difficult to do it as a film. So at that point, I put everything away and went on to do other projects. And it was only about 2 years later that I suddenly thought to myself, do you know what? I don't want to just push this stuff away forever. There is potentially a book here. I'd already interviewed some key cosmonauts who were still alive at the time, almost all of whom had since died. And with that, I went back and pitched it as a book to HarperCollins, and that's where it started. So the sources were original archival film sources. I went there to make a film, and then it turned into a book. But it is difficult. There is always a suspicion. Here I am, a Brit, who is going in to Russia and telling a story about Russia's greatest hero. I mean, a guy that has been turned almost into a saint figure in Russia. He's been turned into an iconic, legendary figure. I mean, we've got a picture, I think I've got it in the book somewhere, but if you just spin to picture 56, you see what he is. 56, we could. That is a square in Moscow called, appropriately enough, Gagarin Square. And it's got an unbelievable, that is really high, that statue, sitting on top of that great big column, made out of titanium, absolutely heroic. That is the kind of figure that Gagarin has become. Every school teacher has to teach the story, a very sanitized version of Yuri Gagarin, to their pupils. And I was coming in with a darker story where I wanted to look at the flaws. This is not a saint, this is a human being. This is somebody who lives and breathes and does all the things that human beings done, and is, like all human beings, is, as I said, flawed. And the flight itself was flawed in many ways, and very brave, very risky, but very, very flawed indeed, and very nearly failed, very disastrously, as I tried to show in my book. So I'm coming in with that story. That is not a comfortable story for many Russians to hear. Interestingly enough, even though we're in the middle of this terrible war with Ukraine, the book is actually going to be published in a Russian version in the next couple of months. And I'm very interested to see what happens with that version. I don't really know. I mean, they'll translate the book that I've got. Whether the book will be successful in Russia, I have no idea, but it may well be, in the current climate, that I will be quite sort of seriously attacked for writing a book like this at all. They love, this is their story. This is their, this is their story. It's not my story. And in fact, in that context, I did have a meeting with the Russian ambassador to the United Kingdom in this unbelievable palace that he lives in London. And it's just unbelievable. It's in a part of London called Kensington. It's incredibly grand. I mean, really grand building. And I had a meeting with him very early on in the process. This is not the current ambassador, it's an ambassador before. And he was extremely cynical and skeptical and suspicious of what it was I was trying to do. At that time, I was actually trying to get a film made. And he said, why would we want to help you do this story when you're British and you're going to do it with Hollywood money? Why would we help you do that? And it's very difficult. So you do get suspicion. But when you get past that, when you get behind the doors, when you get talking to ordinary Russians who are caught up in all the drama and the exhilaration and the excitement of this venture back in the late 50s and early 60s, then people welcome you with open arms. And I just absolutely loved meeting the people that I met. Can I just show you picture 57 for a moment?
Yep.
If you can get to that. This is an example. This is a husband and wife called the Kraskins. He was an engineer in Baikonur. He was a telemetry specialist, actually. And his wife was also a telemetry specialist. They were a young couple. They were in Baikonur in the 1950s when it was all terribly top secret. And it was a bit like Los Alamos was, with the Manhattan Project, with the bomb in New Mexico. And they lived in this little tiny, very Soviet style apartment in New Mexico. In St. Petersburg. I was there on a very snowy night. We filmed an interview with them. They were amazing. We all got terribly drunk on vodka. We all sang songs. And then he showed me this rocket that he built, which was an exact version of the R-7 rocket that he had worked on and which Yuri Gagarin flew on top of when he went to space in 1961. And I'll never forget that the nozzles, I haven't got a picture of it here, but the nozzles, the actual engine nozzles, he wanted to have, they were kind of gold in the original, I think. And all he had was Ferrero Rocher. Those lovely kind of Ferrero Rocher chocolates, which have, I don't know if you have them in America.
Yeah.
He took the foil off them, and that's what he used to create the nozzles of his rocket. So these people were amazing, and I met many like that.
That's cool. Okay, I think the next question is actually perfectly in line with this. Chrissy, if you're there, why don't you go ahead and ask that?
Yes, could you please comment on your style that you used in this book? It reads a lot like a novel or a thriller and really grips the readers from the first page. Did you find it challenging in formatting it this way?
That's a great question, actually. I mean, I've written 2 previous books as well. I mean, mostly I'm a filmmaker. My previous book about the dropping the atomic bomb was written very much in the same kind of style. I think the key thing is I don't think of myself as an academic, and I don't think of myself as a scholar, but I do think of myself as a storyteller. And it's really important to kind of reach out to people. To me, that's what I do as a filmmaker as well. You want to reach people. You have to maintain academic rigor. I was trained as an historian in the UK university, and then subsequently actually in America as well. So I was trained as an historian, and actually in America as an historian of science. So I have that training, but what I think you have to do is wear that training lightly. That doesn't mean that you don't apply all of that academic rigor to your evaluation of the sources, the people you interview, the printed material that you look at. That's all really, really important. I mean, there's quite a lot of footnotes at the back of this book. That's the kind of academic bit, but it needs to be read. It's a terrific tale. It's incredibly thrilling. Here is a guy, the first human being to leave the biosphere. There's 3.5 billion years of history, and suddenly there is this man who leaves and looks down and sees our world for the first time, and sees how beautiful it is, and sees how fragile it is, and how magnificent it is. And he's doing it from a weapon that is designed to destroy it. I mean, how ironic is that? That's a terrific tale. And at the same time, it's happening in the middle of the Cold War, you know, with Cuba happening, with the Berlin Wall about to go up, with these incredible characters of Khrushchev and the new, young, untested President Kennedy, who's really messing up on the job at that point. And you've got this incredibly dramatic confrontation, in many ways like we have again now, between these 2 superpowers. I'm not sure I'd call Russia a superpower today, but back then certainly it was. And you've got all of that, and in the middle of this there is a race, and the race comes down to 3 weeks. I mean, it comes down to 3 weeks, and it's a race to do something extraordinary. That first step to the beyond, you know, that first step to the stars. It's a story. How can you not make that thrilling? In fact, the sad truth is that 90% of the books that I've got sitting on my left-hand side that you can't see, that I had to wade through in order to kind of get some of the secondary material, were quite dull, actually. They're very useful, but they're quite dull. The really interesting part of it was diving into the original printed material, the original stuff that you read from the time, because that's the really exciting stuff. And of course, the witnesses to history who were actually there, most of whom were either very old or have since, as I said, passed away. You're kind of dealing with a twilight of history where memory is slipping into history, effectively. That, it would be criminal as a filmmaker and as a storyteller not to give that everything you can.
I think for the audience at this point, 2 things I'll say. You can see Stephen's enthusiasm, and that comes across in the book. Beyond, it's just a great book, and I think that my students will tell you it's just a great read. Yes, thank you, Heather, for doing that. There it is right there. But let me interrupt for just a second and introduce one of those witnesses of history who was worked on the Apollo programs, and this is a personal connection with me. Tom, if you're available, this is my father-in-law, Tom Hanchett. He wants to say hi to you, Stephen, that worked at that time, one of those witnesses to history.
Wonderful, wonderful. Hello, and I'm delighted you're here. Thank you for being here.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, very clearly.
Okay.
I feel there should be a beep at the end of every slide.
Briefly, I was sitting on my console, sending commands to Mike Collins' spacecraft as he went around the moon. recording his data when he was behind the moon, when the first man stepped on the moon. And right behind me was the flight director, and right to the other side was the ECOM, who kept the spacecraft going with the power and environmental controls. And over to the left was the Capcom, who was talking to Mike Collins and Buzz and Neil. So I'd love to talk to you, because I was so focused on the hardware and what was going on that I missed a lot of things that were going in the world. And I don't know if you can see this or not, but this is the schematic I created that Charlie Duke took on the moon on Apollo 16. It's a copy, but I have the exact document. So this is the kind of thinking I was doing, switches and power and what works.
Wow. Well, I met quite a few equivalents to you in Russia. I met people who have the same passion and the same enthusiasm as you, and were also caught up in something which they felt was incredible and incredibly exciting. You know, I mean, the interesting thing about the Yuri Gagarin story is that it's virtually not known anymore in America. Because
it is here in Houston with our.
Well, of course it is, and that's fantastic. But it probably isn't so much in New York, you know. It's a huge story in Russia still. It's quite a well-known story still in the UK. Although I have to say that my publisher, when I first went to my publisher at HarperCollins in the UK, there was one person on the board who thought that Yuri Gagarin was maybe like a Russian footballer. I mean, they just didn't know who he was. And perhaps less so in America, because of course you had this incredible thing with Neil Armstrong and Apollo 11, which was incredible. The first humans to step on another essentially heavenly body. But there is also something extraordinary about going back before that time and considering the first before the first, which is somehow I think about this guy. I mean, the risks that were taken in that flight are absolutely extraordinary. In order for the Russians to get ahead, which was so vitally important for them at the time in the middle of the Cold War, in order for them to get ahead, they had to take unbelievable risks. I mean, I identify them in the book. I don't need to go through them all here, but we know there were risks with things not tested properly. There were risks with the cabin environment. There were risks with the engines that hadn't been tested properly. There were terrible cock-ups along the way. There was less than 50% chance that Gagarin would come out of that alive. And when his boss made the choice ultimately between the last two candidates, him and this guy called German Titov, who would be the number one guy to go, he also felt and confided as such in his diary that he was going to be sending one of those two people to their deaths, because that's the reality that he felt at the time. It was that dangerous. So there is something quite extraordinary about the primitiveness, if you like, of the technology and the risks they took to do what they needed to do.
I was going to say, when I worked on the Apollo-Soyuz docking mission, we got a chance to look at the hardware they had.
Yeah. And
they didn't have the redundancy we had, the backup.
No.
If we'd had their spacecraft when Apollo 13 blew the side out, those guys were never coming back.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say about that's a very interesting point you're making there. What I would say about that is this: the Americans lost the first space race to Yuri Gagarin and the Russians for three fundamental reasons. The first reason is that because it was a free society and is a free society in the United States, it meant that you couldn't hush up your failures. You couldn't hide them. It meant that if a rocket, in this case a Redstone that Alan Shepard went in, was to blow up on the pad. 40 million Americans would get to watch that on live television. And that would have been an absolute disaster, a total own goal, as we say, a complete PR nightmare at a very, very politically critical time. So that's the first thing that's happening. The first thing that's happening is you've got a society which is closed and a society which is open. An open society cannot afford to take the kind of risks that a closed society can afford to take, because you just hush it up, you lie about it. You know, I mean, Yuri Gagarin wasn't even able to tell his parents what he was doing, let alone flying rockets. Anything to do with what he was doing was top secret. So that's the first thing. The second thing, which I think is really, really important, is that the Russians had these great big rockets that they could get human beings up into space with, and indeed into orbit, unlike the Americans at the time, because they had much more primitive nuclear weapons. Their bombs were much, much heavier than American nuclear weapons. So they required these much, much bigger rockets, much bigger missiles to carry those weapons halfway across the world, or a quarter of the way across the world, which is what the R-7 rocket was basically capable of doing, the rocket that ultimately was modified to get Yuri Gagarin into space and into orbit. And the third thing is that because the American rockets at the time were so much smaller, there was that much more miniaturization that was required. And miniaturization is expensive and it's difficult, and it takes a lot of time and a lot of testing. And the Russians didn't have to do that. They had very primitive systems. I mean, I put them in my book. You guys who've read the book will have seen it. But if we could just have a quick look at the difference between number 33 for a second. We can go to number 33, Heather. Is a picture, when we get it, it's a picture of the Mercury control center in the Cape. Do we have that picture? Can we get that up?
Heather, you got it?
Number 33?
Yeah, sorry, it just was being weird. 1 second.
Okay, well, don't worry. If you can get it up, that'd be great. What I want to do is just show you a comparison that I do have in my book, and you've probably seen it in the pictures. So Mercury control back in the 90s was a completely novel experience back then, a completely new revolutionary idea that you could track a spacecraft all the way around the world. And for its time, it was incredibly advanced and incredibly sophisticated. And it employed a worldwide tracking facility that enabled the Mercury capsules to be tracked as they flew all the way around the world, which only happened after John Glenn in 1962. Very sophisticated for its time. Are we having problems? Can we get it up, or is it number 30? Yeah, that's great. Number 33.
Sorry,
Yeah.
sorry.
Okay, that's okay. Don't worry at all. So that's an original picture of that, and there it is. And you know, it's pretty sophisticated. There's the map on the wall. There are the TV sets up there. It's all pretty impressive in its own way. If you compare that to the next picture, number 33, there. That is exactly the same time. That is what was in the bunker in Baikonur when the R-7 was launched. I mean, it looks like something out of a World War II submarine. I mean, it is incredibly primitive. It's all valves, and the tracking systems are almost non-existent. Yuri Gagarin spent at least 2/3 of his journey completely out of radio contact with anybody. He had nothing, just nobody to speak to. They couldn't pick him up. He was able to pick up some music on his radio, and he was basically listening to music as he went around the world. The tracking systems employed unbelievably primitive computers, even by the standards of the day, nothing like the IBMs that were being used over in the United States, that were at the time, the most sophisticated computers in the world. So you're dealing with a totally different technology. And that's one of the reasons why it was such a shock that the Soviets got ahead. This is a nation that's not supposed to be able to build a working refrigerator, but it gets the first human into space, and it gets that person into space ahead of the United States. So risks are taken, primitive technology, big heavy rockets because they have big heavy bombs. And if it all goes wrong and the thing blows up on the launch pad, nobody has to know. That's the key to this success. I mean, it's a hell of a risk that they took in a way that would just never have happened in the US. And when it came to a much bigger venture, like going to the moon, that kind of approach was never going to work. It just was never going to work. And that's one of the reasons why the Soviet lunar program fell further and further and further behind, until finally it was just a non-starter compared to Apollo.
All right, Carlos, I think you've got your hand raised, so unmute yourself and ask your question, please.
Yes, sir. So, excuse me. I wanted to ask this question because it kind of fit what we were talking about. One of my favorite parts of Beyond was the conversation about Korolev. And I was just so surprised that I have never heard of the engineer, the Russian engineer behind the space program.
Yeah.
I just wanted to hear your opinion on von Braun versus Korolev.
Yeah.
If Korolev was working with such primitive technology, what does that say about his engineering capabilities when you compare him to von Braun?
Yeah.
Is he really way better, or was it because he could keep it a secret that he was able to accomplish so much?
That's a very, very, very interesting and very good question. I was absolutely bowled over by the Korolev story. I think he's the most powerful character in my book, personally. I found him fascinating to write. I really did. I mean, he's quite a tortured character. And he's obviously a brilliant engineer. Let's take it from an engineering point of view. Let's just start with that. Von Braun, brilliant engineer, no question. I mean, a great organizer too. A great, in a way, leader in his field at Huntsville. But the thing you've got to understand about von Braun, he's a rocket guy, right? What he does is he builds rockets. I mean, that's a very primitive way of saying it, but that's what he does. He builds Redstones, he builds Junos, he builds Saturns. You know, that's what the guy does. He builds V1s, or rather V2s, forgive me, that were used on Antwerp and London in World War II. That's what he does. Korolev is quite different. He does rockets too. He builds a bigger rocket than anyone else has in the world with the R7, which I think has its first launch in 1957. Well, you know, really advanced. You're talking about a rocket that at the time could get to New York from the Soviet Union, carrying a 5 megaton bomb. That's 200 times the size of a Hiroshima bomb. In 1957, he had that rocket. That's pretty amazing. I'm not saying there weren't people under him. Of course there were, as they were with von Braun, but you've got to have a leader. But he's also doing all this other stuff. He's also getting probes off, first to the moon, very successfully. He's getting probes off to Mars. He's getting probes off to Venus. This is the late 1950s. He's also getting dogs into space, into orbit, bringing them back with the Belka and Strelka dogs in 1960. And then, of course, he's also getting humans into space with Yuri Gagarin in 1961. This is incredible. There's no one in the NASA program that was like that. There was no one that did that. There was no one that was capable. Von Braun wasn't designing the Apollo capsule. He wasn't designing the Mercury capsule. There was the Space Task Group. You know, there was McDonnell. There were all these other corporations that were doing all of that. And I'm not saying that von Braun wasn't brilliant in his own right, but in terms of the engineering, you're dealing, I think, with a different level. I do think that. I think the vision is the same. I think what makes von Braun a difficult character is his Nazi background. There's no question that he signed a Faustian pact with Hitler. You know, I want to build these rockets. I don't care if they have bombs on them. I'll build these rockets with bombs on them. And in return, he becomes an SS officer. He employs concentration camp labor. That's now fully documented. Yeah. And he became an embarrassment in the mid-1970s and onwards. It's a difficult one because the guy was a genius, but there's a problem there, unquestionably. And it's an uncomfortable story. It really is. The Korolev story is extraordinary. He's a guy that's actually a victim of the Stalin regime. He's actually sent to prison. He's sent to Kolyma, which is a brutal, brutal prison camp out in the middle of Siberia, where his jaw is smashed up and he has terrible heart problems, which dog him for the rest of his life. And, you know, and he's made to dig for gold in these terribly badly maintained mine shafts in the middle of the Siberian winter. So it's he's a victim in that respect, but he also was a learner. As I say in my book, he became somebody who realized he had to be politically savvy. He had to be, because the consequences of not being politically savvy in Stalinist Russia, and indeed, frankly, in Putin's Russia, are not pretty compared to not getting it quite right in the United States, which is a democratic and a free society, and where, you know, you can say things that you simply cannot say in the Soviet Union or indeed in today's Russia. So you're dealing with a guy that has great engineering sophistication, is a brilliant manipulator, and has gone through a very, very, very tough experience. None of us can possibly, at least I can't speak for you guys, I cannot possibly imagine what it must be like to go through the Gulag in Stalinist Soviet Union in the late 1930s, in the middle of the Great Terror. I mean, 90% of these people were just shot. You know, they would pick up, and it was incredible that he was not shot. So to survive all of that is pretty remarkable. So he does become a kind of hero figure. I'm not ashamed to say that. I mean, he's tortured, he's messed up, he's flawed. He's, to me, much more interesting than Yuri Gagarin. He's much more human, and he's really quite remarkable. I mean, Gagarin's remarkable in the sense that he had to be the bravest of lab rats, you know? He had to sit there and just exist and not die, basically. Just endure this kind of horribly, you know, I mean, he was obviously an incredibly brave man. There's no doubts about that whatsoever. Anybody would be to step in there. It's virtual death sentence, as I was saying earlier on. Korolev was the man with the imagination and the clout and the political know-how to make this thing happen, to make it happen.
Do we have a picture of him, Stephen?
Sorry?
Do we have a picture of him?
Oh, God, please, absolutely. Sorry, I'm being very foolish here. I'll show you a couple of pictures, actually. I'll show you the first picture is number 20. Sorry, thank you, John. And do remind me when I go off on one, because
That's okay.
I do that. Number 20, Heather, if we could, is a picture of him in his famous, what he called his happy coat. I think that's the coat he liked to wear for launches. I think he was quite superstitious. He thought it would give him good luck. And I think he had a couple of, I mentioned the book, of 1 kopeck pieces, coins in his pocket, which also gave him luck. He, unfortunately, on the day that he died, when he went to had to have an operation, which went horribly wrong, he was devastated when he was on his way to the hospital for the operation, because he couldn't find his lucky coins. And indeed he died, I think, under the operating knife a couple of days later when he had the operation. Another picture we should show is the next one, 21. That's just a bit of the barbed wire in Kolyma in a typical Siberian winter. I should say that I've been to Siberia. I didn't go to Siberia for this. I went to Siberia for a movie that I directed back in 2008-9. And it was shown at the Novosibirsk Film Festival. Novosibirsk is the capital of Siberia. It's a 5-hour flight east of Moscow. And my God, I mean, it is the most extraordinary place. I don't know if anybody there's been there, but the main squares, I remember, was dominated by a statue of Stalin. And it is cold. I mean, but not as cold as it gets there. I mean, that's where he was. He's digging underneath that for gold. The guy never wore gold for the rest of his life in any form or shape. Another interesting picture of him, which we should show actually, is, if I can find it here, is number 29. Can we go to number 29? That's him with Yuri Gagarin. And I interviewed Korolev's daughter, who's called Natalia. She was in her mid-80s. And she has a sort of, her flat in a little apartment in Moscow is turned into a kind of a shrine. It's really extraordinary to her dad. And she never got to see her dad very much because he was working all the time. He divorced his first wife, and his first wife did not really want their daughter, to have much contact with her father. She became a doctor. She was an amazing woman. I interviewed her. She's written a 2-volume biography in Russian of her father, which was translated into English, and she gave me an English translation. But she said that he loved Yuri Gagarin like a son. And I can see it all in that picture. That face, to me, is a father's face looking with love at his own son. And you will never, I defy anyone here, much as I respect the work that von Braun did in getting humans to space and to obviously to the moon, you will be hard put to find a picture of Werner von Braun that looks anything like that. There's real humanity.
Sailor, or excuse me, not, yeah, it is Sailor. You have the next question. If you're, unmute yourself and go ahead and ask it.
Can y'all hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so one of my favorite parts and aspects of your book is how you balance the Soviet and the US experiences in the book. So I just wanted to ask, how did you balance the writing and research process of this, and what challenges did that bring you when you wrote the book?
That's another, they're great questions I'm getting here. This is, I think it's the best audience I've had. This is great questions. I will try to answer that as best I can. So remember, I started this as a film, okay? So I started this as a film. I made my pitch in 2012. I went to Russia 3 times. I interviewed, I think, about 9 key people, a number of cosmonauts. I interviewed a man called Alexei Leonov, who was the first man to walk in space. He was amazing. He's dead now. Really interesting interview. And I interviewed some of the original, others of the original cosmonauts that were selected in 1960, in secret, of course. So I already had a body of work there. I hadn't done any work on the American side at all. So now spin forward, books commissioned in, I don't know, end of 2018, I think it was. And, I knew I had to get it out for 21 in its hardback edition for the anniversary. It's not very much time. So I had to really get my skates on and get moving. So I hired a researcher that I've worked with many, many times before, who's Russian but lives in the UK. I said to her, you need to start setting me up with some Russian people that are central to this story. And we need to also start working on the archive side as well. So she got on with that. I also said, we really want to go to Baikonur. And she said, well, let's see if we can get in there. It's really hard to get in there. And it is hard to get in there. And it's very expensive to get in there as well. But we timed it so that we could actually go there when there was this launch that I was describing earlier on. Because I really wanted to get, again, the storytelling thing. I wanted to get that visceral, I used that word visceral before, didn't I? Impact of a launch, because that's kind of what it must have been like for those people watching Yuri Gagarin go. Okay, so I needed to do that. Then I, on my side, got on with the American side. So I got in touch with a bunch of people here in Houston, or there in Houston at the Space Center. I got interviews with some people there. I mean, the really great interview I had was with Glyn Lunny, who was fantastic, and had been there right at the very beginning. And he's now very sadly passed away. But he was fantastically helpful. He introduced me to other people there, right? Because we're looking at the early days, the kind of the Gene Kranz, Chris Kraft, the real beginning of all of that. So I was really interested in Mercury control and how it all worked and all of that. I also then went down to the Cape. But I took in a lot of archives along the way. There was a great guy who you'll know, called Dutch von Ehrenfried, who was fantastically helpful to me as well, who also worked later, obviously in mission control, but had also been there right back in the early days. Then I went down to the Cape, and I'd read an article somewhere which had interviews with some of the rocket guys, the guys who were in the bunker, the launch blockhouses, effectively, over on the Cape, on the pads. And I met a bunch of them as well, and did a fantastic day with them where they introduced me to each other, and we went out to the pads and they showed me around the Cape and where they'd been and the blockhouses, and we did all of that as well. So that was a lot of that. That was the people research in America, which took about 2.5, 3 weeks. The paper research was all of the key, mostly NASA and the National Archives. So I developed very good relationships with people in some of the key archives. In Huntsville, there's people at the Johnson Space Center. I can't remember names now if you ask me, but there were some very key people there. Obviously, there was the main National Archives in Washington, DC. I knew people from other projects I'd done before. And of course, down in the Cape as well. So I kind of made friends. I cajoled. I tried to charm people into helping me. I pressured people. People were openly very willing to help me. In some cases, maybe less so because they had, you know, other things to get on with. But bit by bit, material started to come in. So I did that on that side. Then I went to Russia again, and I did a big tour around Russia. I was in Moscow. I was in Baikonur. I was in a place called Saratov, where Gagarin landed, but where he also and trained in iron foundry work back in the late 1950s. And I also went to his hometown, which used to be called Gzhatsk and is now Gagarin, where I saw his house, which is in number 26. It's in the book, but I'm going to show you some pictures that aren't in the book in a minute. But picture number 26, for those who haven't seen, just before that, that's the house just outside his hometown, which was built by his father, made of spruce. That he grew up in. And in the next picture, we see the bunker that his family, his father, who's a brilliant carpenter, was forced to build by the Germans when the Germans invaded after June 1941. And you know the story in the book. Those who've read the book know that he was, the house was taken over by the Nazis. The family was 4 children and the parents were forced to live in that bunker for nearly 2 years. There was no education any longer. The school had been burned down by the Germans, along with a lot of the farm animals as well. And the terrible story that happened, which I describe in my book, but some who might not know it, who are here, was that when he was, I think, 9 years old, he might have been even younger than that, actually, Gagarin's younger brother, Boris, who was 2 years younger, was hanged from a tree in the garden, which actually is in the next picture. If we go to the next picture, Heather, it's one of, I think it's the tree. I think that's actually a new tree now, but it's in that same location where the tree is that we're looking at. It's an apple tree. And one of the Nazi soldiers, on a whim really, just picked up this 5-year-old boy, Gagarin's youngest brother, tied a scarf around him and just hung him from the branch. And Yuri Gagarin witnessed this and tried to get his brother down, but couldn't. He was too little. I mean, Yuri Gagarin was too little. He was a tiny boy, ran back to that bunker, screaming for his mother. His mother came rushing out and managed to cut her son down, and he was still alive. He didn't speak for weeks and weeks and weeks. And in fact, actually, many, many years later, as an alcoholic, he hanged himself. He committed suicide. But Yuri saw that. And according to his sister, who's dead, but in an eyewitness account that I read, his sister said it changed him totally. He just became tough. He was still very smiley and could be a delightful boy, but there was a toughness about him that she said we'd never seen before. And I believe it was that toughness that stayed with him right the way through. And it was that toughness that enabled him to be the first human being to sit on top of an intercontinental ballistic missile and waited for somebody to light the fuse.
Terry, you've got the next question.
Okay, so this is more a fun question. Star Trek or Star Wars?
Well, I have never, ever seen Star Wars, ever. I can't believe I'm saying that, but I've never seen it. I never have. I've seen all the Star Trek movies. So, and, you know, I remember Star Trek on telly when I was in my teens, you know, in the 70s. So I think it's got to be Star Trek, actually. But I'm ready to be convinced that I'm missing something much bigger and better. I don't know. But Star Trek, I like the much later incarnations too, as well. So the movies I'm talking about, actually. I don't watch the later TV series. I haven't seen those. But I have seen, you know, the much more recent movies, and I've enjoyed them a lot, actually. I take my daughter to them. She thinks the guy playing Captain Kirk is really hot. So she really enjoys that.
Well, we're running out of a bit of time here, but we've got time for a couple more questions. I'm going to reserve the last one for myself. Let's see, Alexis, next question.
All right, so I'm gonna go with interesting one. Well, not interesting, but like I wanted to know why, for your introduction for Beyond, why you went with the Soviet dogs. I kind of thought to myself, that's a pretty interesting cool touch. into the
Well,
book?
it's just I went really at an angle. I mean, you read 99% of books about the history of the space race, and they always start with Sputnik. Everything starts the same way, They start with that date when Sputnik went up and the Americans got really upset, and then you go into the next 4 years and everything else. And I thought, you know what? I'm not going to do that. I'm going to dive into a story about some dogs. I mean, what an amazing tale that is. You go into a story, there are two dogs who are somewhere in Siberia in the middle of a snowstorm with a bomb on board that's ticking away. And in 24 hours, that bomb's going to blow up and it's going to take the dogs with them. I
Kevin,
mean,
do we have a
from
picture of the
every
dog?
level, that is great. That's a great tale to tell. And we don't have the dog there,
Yeah.
unfortunately. That's one of the dogs, but unfortunately, we don't have the dog there. But I just thought to myself, that's just great. That's just drama. I mean, and of course, it's all true, which makes it even better. And it's a good time way in because it's in December 1960, so only 5 months before. And I like the idea of trying to tell a story over a period of 5 months. Of course, I have to do backstory. I will have to tell Sputnik. I will have to tell a bit about that side of things, and I do. And in fact, but you don't have to dive in there straight away. What you do is you need to kind of grab your audience and grab your readers with a story. And to me, it's got everything. It's got a bomb. It's got that James Bond thing. It's got a bomb. It's got a time bomb. It's got people. It's got dogs. Everyone wants the dogs to be alive, right? It's got a snowstorm. It's got, are they going to make it? Are they not? Is this thing going to blow up? And they've got to defuse it. And it's all top secret. And, I mean, the Beyond is being written right now as a screenplay, TV series. And it's being written by a writer. I can't say very much. It's all kind of, I probably said more than I should have said. But it's being written right now. And I'm very interested to see what happens with it. But so it's a writer he lives actually in Australia, although he's not Australian. And he's got a fantastic track record, done some films you would have seen. And I'm sure, and he's writing it now. And it's all of this stuff. I mean, there's another great story that we might go with in the screenplay version, the TV series version, which is a story told by those guys that had the rocket that I just showed you, the Kraskins, the husband and wife with the Ferrero Rocher rocket. And that's an amazing story about how, and he told me this story. This guy told me, he was a telemetry guy, right? He tells me a story how in 1959, they launched, it wasn't an R7, I think it was an R9. They launched an intercontinental ballistic missile on a test from Baikonur, right? And it goes off course. And this is totally true. And it heads towards San Francisco. And they can't stop it. And they're sitting there thinking, we're going to start World War III. The ELINT guys in south of Alaska, they're going to see an ICBM heading directly for San Francisco. And amazingly, it goes slightly off course. And through this kind of onboard bomb thing, they're able to destroy it. I don't know, the details are all very obscure, but they managed to get this thing to explode it before it actually got beyond the far eastern mainland of the Soviet Union. But it was probably 3 or 4 minutes flying time away at that point from San Francisco. So again, it's how you go into a story. It probably won't happen like this, but I said to this writer, we had a meeting the other day, I said, why don't we go with that? Start with a bunker and a missile that's gone off course and is heading towards San Francisco, the same bunker that we've actually going to be launching Yuri Gagarin from, the same personnel, the same people, and it can go horribly wrong. And we could find ourselves in a nuclear war because we could find ourselves having missiles launched against us if that's perceived by the American defense systems as being a genuine threat, okay? So it's where you go in is the point, and to me, it's, I mean, in my last book, before that Hiroshima book, the Shockwave book, I started with a love story. I started with 2 people in a garden the night before the bomb dropped, holding hands, who were in love. And it's a love story, it's a totally true story that was told to me. And it's a love story that goes the whole way through that book. It's people like you and me,
Okay, last question, Stephen. I could listen to you all day. So you dedicate the book to your daughter.
I did. She'd have killed me if I hadn't.
What do you think the future holds for space? What's it gonna be like when she's our age?
Well, I'm really scared of making predictions, John, because when I was in my teens, right? Actually, even younger than that, I thought to myself that I would take my kids to Mars. I really did believe that, because that's where it was all going. We got to the moon in 69. I was 8 years old. As far as I was concerned, I would definitely, by the time I got to my 30s, I remember thinking this, by the time we get to the turn of the century, I will definitely have been in orbit and probably have gone to the moon on holiday. And by the time I get to 2020, and as old as I now am, I would certainly have gone to Mars and stayed at a hotel on Mars and seen all of that. And of course, so to make those predictions are very, very dangerous. I do think there are certain key things that have changed. I think that the introduction of private capital and private enterprise into the space ventures or the space adventure, with people, love them or hate them, I'm not going to go there, but people who are in their own way quite visionary, like Bezos and like Musk, are going to change things. It is changing things. We can see it. I mean, there seems to be much more activity than there has been since the Apollo times, really. And the Cape is a very, very busy place. I'm sure that Johnson Space Center is a very, very busy place now in a way that it wasn't for a while. There was a dead period for a long time where it wasn't cool. No one was interested. It wasn't sort of happening. Now people are talking again. They're talking about it, which is one of the reasons why my book, people are reading it, because this is like the beginning. This is where it all starts. And it kind of starts, it really revs up to Apollo, and then everybody knows what happens after that. It kind of loses its way. I mean, some interesting things, like we talked about Apollo-Soyuz, which is an interesting thing. Obviously, there was Skylab, there were things happening, but it's kind of a bit like not quite sure of its direction, money, there's no real political will. And what has happened in the last few years is remarkable. And it's really very exciting, and the technology is really exciting. And so I do feel things are revving up again, and I hope I'm going to be around for a few more years, and I hope that I'm going to see some really exciting things. And I will be, the idea that I remember when Neil Armstrong landed on the moon and saw that with my grandfather, and maybe one day I will be with a grandchild. I don't have grandchildren yet, but I will have a grandchild, and I'll be able to watch people walking on the surface of Mars. Would be incredible, absolutely incredible. So it's exciting, and there are possibilities that lie ahead.
I would like to, Heather, put the picture of the book up again. We'd like to, from Lone Star College, Stephen, we'd like to all thank you for this wonderful talk. This has been so delightful. And I think in a way, to have a talk about space from London to Houston and the international aspect of it is just so appropriate. And again, we're very grateful to you. And I want to recommend to everybody in the audience that you rush out to the bookstore or go to a website and get that book. There's his website, StephenWalkerBeyond.com. There's his Twitter handle, and it's just a fascinating read. And as Chrissy said earlier in the session, it reads like a thriller. It really does.
Thank you.
So I'd like to thank the audience. Thank you, and thank you, Stephen.
Thank you. Yeah, well, thanks very much indeed, and thanks for such a brilliant audience. Great questions, really lovely. Thank you very much.
Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe for more content from LSC-Kingwood.